Bighorn Foothills, Wyoming, late summer of 1882. The air, thin and sharp, carried the scent of pine and distant dust. On the valley floor, the sounds were familiar, the ring of hammers on wood, the shouts of men raising log walls against the coming winter. But up on the northern slope, where a gash of raw granite split the hillside, Iorwerth Pryce was making a different kind of noise. It was the grating screech of iron on stone, a sound that set a man's teeth on edge. He and his 2 weary oxen were wrestling the first of 6 curved corrugated iron arches toward the mouth of a deep, narrow cleft in the rock. The thing looked like the rib of some colossal metal beast, and the valleymen who stopped their work to watch thought Pryce was a fool. Calhoun Westmark, a cattle drover whose face was a road map of wind and sun, reined in his horse at the base of the slope. He squinted up at the Welshman, a small, stubborn figure against the immense grayness of the rock. "What in God's name is he doing, Jed?" he asked the man beside him. Jedediah Stone, the settlement's most respected carpenter, shook his head, a gesture of both pity and disgust. "He calls it a house. Bought those arches from the railroad surplus in Cheyenne. Says he's going to slide them into that crack and live in it. Like a badger in a hole." "A badger in a hole?" Westmark repeated, the words tasting like grit. He looked at the cabins rising in the valley, sturdy, honest structures of saddle-notched pine, chinked with mud and faith. That was how a man built. You stood your ground, squared your walls, and faced the sky. You didn't crawl into the earth. It's madness. That whole fissure will come down on him in the first spring thaw. A man who wasn't raised by these mountains has no business trusting them to be his roof. Another rancher, Silas Croft, spat a stream of tobacco juice. "He's not building a home. He's digging a grave. Poor woman, poor children. It's a crazy idea, born of desperation." The verdict settled over the valley like the early dust of evening. Iorwerth Pryce, the quiet man from a land of rain and slate, was foolish. He was building a house that wasn't a house, a strange iron shell disappearing into a flaw in the landscape. They watched him work, his movements precise and economical, and they laughed. The mockery was not loud or cruel, but it was constant, a low hum of certainty from men who knew how to survive a Wyoming winter. They knew, and he clearly did not. What did this Welsh slate hewer understand about wind shadow and mass coupling that a seasoned cattle drover, a man who lived by reading the wind, had missed? I'm going to show you how a man with no carpentry skills built the warmest, safest shelter in all of Wyoming, using nothing but surplus iron and a deep understanding of stone. The principles he used were a century ahead of their time, and they can still teach us about the difference between fighting nature and working with it. Stick with me, and I promise you will learn the fundamental physics of how the earth itself can be your furnace. I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing to this channel for more stories of forgotten ingenuity. Let me know in the comments if you've ever seen a structure that seemed completely out of place, but just worked. Iorwerth Pryce was not a carpenter. He was not a farmer, nor was he a frontiersman in the way the men in the valley understood the term. He was a man of the crevice, the seam, the sheer stone face. His hands, though now calloused from handling oxen and iron, were shaped by a different trade. For 20 years, they had known the specific heft of a slate hammer, the cold bite of a splitting chisel, the grain and character of rock cleaved from the mountains of Blaenau-Festiniog. He had spent his life underground or clinging to quarry walls, setting charges and splitting rock into perfect, paper-thin sheets of roofing slate. He understood pressure, fissure, and the immense patient stability of stone. He knew that a mountain's weakness, a cleft, or a fault line could also be a place of profound shelter. He had come to Wyoming with his wife Rhiannon and their 2 children, 10-year-old Owen and 7-year-old Bronwyn. They sought land, air, a life not spent in the damp grayness of the quarries. What they found was a cold more absolute and hostile than anything they had ever imagined. Their first winter, in 1881, was the anvil on which Iorwerth's new idea was forged. They lived in a hastily built log cabin, a structure Jedediah Stone himself had helped them raise, pronouncing it snug as any. It was not. The wind, a living entity in the Bighorn foothills, found every microscopic gap in the chinking. It forced its way through the door jamb and down the stone chimney. The heat from their little stove was ripped away as fast as it was produced. The suffering was a quiet, grinding affair, a litany of small defeats. Iorwerth remembered waking one morning to find his leather work boots, left too far from the fire, frozen solid to the puncheon floor. He'd had to pry them loose, tearing a sliver of wood with them. Rhiannon's prized sourdough starter, a living thing she had carefully transported all the way from Wales, was found one morning in its stoneware crock, a frozen dead mass with a crack running clean through the ceramic. But the image that haunted Iorwerth the most, the one that spoke of a cold so deep it changed the laws of physics, was the dog's water dish. Left near the door, the water had frozen solid. Days later, after a particularly brutal cold snap, the block of ice was simply gone, leaving behind a bone-dry bowl. It had not melted. The impossibly dry cold air had stolen the water molecule by molecule, a process the circuit-riding preacher called sublimation. The ice had vanished into thin air, like a ghost. That was the moment Iorwerth knew a conventional house was a losing battle. A wooden box, no matter how well built, was just a temporary obstacle to the Wyoming wind. It was a fight he couldn't win, so he decided not to fight at all. The problem with a frontier cabin wasn't the logs. The problem was the air, specifically the air moving at high speed. The men of the Bighorn foothills understood insulation. They packed mud, moss, and grass into the gaps between logs. They banked snow against their foundations. They hung heavy blankets over their doors. But they were fundamentally misunderstanding the primary nature of their enemy. In a place like Wyoming, the greatest thief of heat is not conduction through a solid wall, but convection, the stripping away of warmth by moving air. A log wall, 12 inches thick, has an R value of about 15. It's a decent insulator, but that number is measured in still air. In a 70-mile-per-hour wind, the effective R value plummets. The wind scours the outer surface of the logs, creating a powerful pressure differential that pulls warm air out from inside through every crack and seam. A candle flame inside would flicker and dance, not from a draft under the door, but from air being sucked directly through the walls. The family inside is effectively living in a leaky wooden box, frantically burning wood to heat air that is being stolen from them every second. Silas Croft's family knew this intimately. They burned through 12 cords of wood that first winter, a staggering amount of labor for a meager return. Their cabin was a landscape of tiered temperatures. You were either sweating next to the stove or freezing 5 feet away. Water buckets in the corners grew thick coats of ice. At night, they slept under a mountain of buffalo hides and quilts, their breath pluming in the dark. It was survival, but it was a siege, a battle of attrition they were slowly losing. Jedediah Stone, the master carpenter, fared better, his joinery tighter, his chinking more meticulous. But even he admitted to burning more wood than he liked, to waking up to frost flowers tracing the nail heads on his interior walls, each nail a tiny thermal bridge conducting the killing cold straight into his house. They were all fighting the same war, armed with the same weapons, wood and fire. They built thicker walls, bigger fireplaces. They were confronting the wind head on. Iorwerth Pryce, remembering the steady, seasonless cool of the deep slate mines, decided to turn his back to it entirely. The construction was a spectacle. For weeks, the valley watched as Pryce prepared his chosen site. The cleft was a clean, vertical fracture in a granite buttress about 6 feet wide at the mouth and narrowing slightly as it went back. He spent a week just sounding the walls with a hammer, listening for the solid ring that told him the rock was stable, free of hidden fractures. This was his trade. He could read the story of the stone in the echo of his hammer blows. Then came the iron arches. Getting them up the slope was a trial of sweat and curses, of straining oxen and fraying ropes. Once there, the real work began. Pryce built a simple timber slipway, greased with tallow, leading into the mouth of the cleft. One by one, he and his long-suffering oxen winched the heavy arches onto the slipway and carefully, painstakingly, slid them into the rock. He set them 28 feet deep, creating a long, tunnel-like room. The final arch was set flush with the outer rock face. Calhoun Westmark rode up one afternoon, watching the process with a critical eye. Pryce was checking the spacing between the iron and the rock wall, using a 6-inch wooden stick as a gauge. The gap was uniform, a perfect half-foot of still air on both sides and over the top. "Pryce," Westmark called out, his voice echoing slightly in the granite opening. "I've seen 100 rock slides in these hills. Snowmelt gets into a crack, freezes, and pops 1,000 tons of granite loose like a cork from a bottle. You're putting your wife and children inside a deadfall trap." It wasn't mockery. It was a genuine warning from a man who respected the mountain's capacity for sudden violence. Valley men know not to trust a mountain they didn't raise themselves. This is a mistake. Iorwerth Pryce straightened up, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a dusty hand. He looked at the drover, then at the granite wall beside him, placing a hand on its sun-warmed surface. "The rock is sound, Mr. Westmark," he said, his Welsh accent softening the edges of the words. "She has been standing here a long time. She will stand here a while longer." He then turned back to his work, and the conversation was over. The front of the structure was the only part that resembled a house. Pryce built a traditional timber-framed facade to seal the opening. He was clumsy with the wood, his cuts less certain than Jedediah stones, his joints less perfect, but he made it thick, packing the space between the inner and outer planks with sawdust from his cutting. He set a sturdy door in the middle and 2 small double-paned windows, a costly extravagance he'd insisted on. A stovepipe flue ran up from the interior, exiting through a carefully sealed hole in the iron roof and extending 20 feet up the rock face, secured with iron pitons. He drove into the granite. When it was finished, it was deeply strange to behold. From the valley, you saw only a small, unremarkable wooden wall tucked into the base of a cliff. The house itself was invisible, swallowed by the mountain. Rhiannon, a practical woman, confessed her unease one evening. "It does not look like a home, Iorwerth. It looks like the entrance to a mine." "A mine is warm in winter, Cariad," he replied softly, "and safe from the wind." What the valley saw as a tomb, Iorwerth saw as a fortress, built on 2 immutable principles of physics. The first was simple: wind shadow. A 70-mile-per-hour wind exerts a pressure of roughly 20 pounds on every square foot of a vertical surface. For a standard cabin wall, that's thousands of pounds of force, driving cold air into every pore of the structure. Pryce's home presented only a small wooden facade to the wind. The main body of the shelter, the 28-foot-long iron arch, was completely untouched. The sheer granite walls of the cleft took the full force of the wind, creating a pocket of perfectly still air around his living space. Without the wind, The primary engine of heat loss was gone. But the second principle was the true genius of the design: thermal mass coupling. A log cabin has very little thermal mass. It heats up fast when you light a fire, and it cools down just as fast when the fire dies. It's like a tin cup, easy to heat, easy to cool. The mountain, however, was a different thing entirely. The granite buttress that held Pryce's home weighed millions of tons. It was a colossal thermal battery. Deep underground, the Earth maintains a constant temperature, roughly the average annual air temperature of the region. In the Bighorn foothills, this was about 47 degrees Fahrenheit. The granite of the mountain was directly connected to this immense, stable heat source. While the air temperature outside might swing from 80 degrees in summer to 40 below zero in winter, the rock itself, a few feet in, would barely budge from that 47-degree baseline. By placing his iron shell within 6 inches of the granite on 3 sides, Iorwerth had done something revolutionary. He had coupled his home to the mountain's thermal mass. That 47-degree rock was constantly radiating a gentle, unwavering warmth into the air gap around his house. It meant the absolute lowest temperature the outside of his iron shell could ever reach was the temperature of the rock itself. He wasn't trying to heat a house from the inside out against a minus 40-degree wind. He was living inside a space whose background temperature was permanently fixed at a life-sustaining 47 degrees. His small stove didn't have to fight the Wyoming winter. It only had to lift the interior temperature from a stable 47 degrees to a comfortable 70. It was the difference between heating a tent in a blizzard and heating a basement room. That winter, the test came. It began not with snow, but with wind. A katabatic windstorm, a uniquely violent feature of the Bighorn Range. Supercooled air from the high peaks grew dense and heavy, then cascaded down the slopes into the valleys, accelerating under gravity into a relentless, scouring torrent. For 8 straight days, the wind blew at a sustained 70 miles per hour. It wasn't a blizzard. It was a dry, clear, ferocious cold. In the valley, it was hell. The wind made a sound, like a freight train that never passed. It peeled shingles from roofs and scoured the snow cover down to the frozen dirt. At the Croft Ranch, a window pane shattered, and the room was filled with a vortex of icy air before they could board it over. They huddled around their stove, feeding it constantly, yet the cold seeped into their bones. Their water barrels inside the cabin froze solid. Inside the mountain, life went on. The first sign of the storm for the Pryce family was the sound, a low, distant roar like a faraway ocean. But inside their strange home, the air was utterly still. The flame in their oil lamp burned straight and tall. Rhiannon was teaching Bronwyn to knit, their fingers nimble and warm. Owen was on the floor, working out sums on a piece of slate. The most profound proof of their sanctuary hung on the interior wall, a wall Iorwerth had built a few inches inside the iron shell. It was a beautiful pendulum clock, a family heirloom they had brought from Wales. Throughout the 8-day storm, it ticked with quiet, steady precision. Every other pendulum clock in the valley had stopped. The bitter cold had thickened the lubricating oil in their mechanisms, slowing and eventually halting the delicate escapements. Jedediah Stone's prized mantle clock stopped on day 3. Silas Croft's stopped on day 2. But Pryce's clock bolted to a wall that was itself bolted to the iron shell, which was in turn warmed by the 47-degree granite just inches away, kept perfect time. It was more than a clock. It was a scientific instrument, measuring a stability that no other home possessed. The steady, reassuring tick-tock was the sound of Iorwerth's vindication. On the 9th day, the wind broke. Calhoun Westmark, his face chapped raw, and his heart heavy with worry for his men and his cattle, rode to the crest of a high ridge overlooking the valley. His task was a grim one: to count the smoke columns, the vital signs of the scattered homesteads. He scanned the horizon, his gut tightening. The croft's chimney was smoking, but the plume was thin and ragged, a sign of a nearly exhausted woodpile. The stones was better, a steady but sharply angled stream of gray, bent almost horizontal by the lingering gale. He counted 2, 3, 4 more, all of them telling the same story of a desperate, near-run fight against the cold. Then his eyes moved to the granite buttress on the north slope, and he saw it. A single, unwavering column of smoke, rising from the base of the cliff. It was perfectly straight. It rose a good 20 feet into the air before the wind on the exposed ridge finally caught it and tore it apart. Down in the protected mouth of that cleft, the air was so calm that the smoke could rise without disturbance. While every other home was still being battered by the storm's aftermath, the Pryce homestead sat in a pocket of absolute tranquility. Westmark stared, the sight reordering the world in his mind. The foolishness wasn't the Welshman's. It was his. It was everyone's. They had all been fighting the enemy on the wrong battlefield. He urged his tired horse down the treacherous slope, his gaze fixed on that impossible plume of smoke. He found Pryce outside, calmly shoveling a small drift of snow that had accumulated against the timber facade. The man didn't even look tired. He looked rested. Westmark dismounted, his legs stiff with cold. He walked toward the cleft, bracing himself for the wind he knew was still howling across the landscape. He took 3 steps into the space between the granite walls, and the world went silent. The roaring in his ears stopped. The biting wind on his face vanished. The air was still and noticeably warmer. He could feel a faint, radiant heat coming off the rock. He looked up at the straight column of smoke. He looked at Pryce, who simply nodded a greeting. Westmark was a man of few words, and apologies did not come easily to him. He didn't offer one. Instead, he reached out a gloved hand and laid it on the granite wall. He expected to feel the deep, biting cold of stone in winter. Instead, the rock felt merely cool, not frozen. It felt stable, alive. He finally understood. He turned to the Welshman, his voice full of a new and profound respect. "Pryce," he said, the words forming slowly as the idea took shape. "You didn't build a house to fight the wind." He paused, searching for the right way to say it. "You just stepped behind a wall the mountain had already finished for you." Iorwerth Pryce allowed himself a small, rare smile. "The mountain is a good neighbor," he said, "if you know how to ask." Calhoun Westmark was the foreman for one of the largest cattle outfits in the territory. He was a practical man, and he knew a practical solution when he saw one. That spring, he sat down and wrote a 2-page report for the Wyoming Stock Growers Association's quarterly bulletin. It was not a story about a stubborn Welshman. It was a technical document titled, "A Proposed Design for Windproofed Line Shacks and Emergency Shelters." He described the principles in plain, direct language. He wrote of using the land itself as a windbreak, of digging into hillsides or utilizing rock outcroppings. He detailed Pryce's method of using the iron arches, but he also generalized the principle: build in the lee, couple to the earth's mass. He included a simple sketch showing a cross-section of the cleft house. He ended the report with a stark piece of data. His outfit had lost over 300 head of cattle in the Katabatic storm, many frozen in the lee of useless wooden windbreaks. The Pryce family, he noted, had not even lost a chicken. The bulletin was printed and distributed to every major ranch and cattle operation, from the Platte River to the Powder River Basin. Foremen and ranch hands, men who trusted Westmark's judgment, read the report. The idea, stripped of its strangeness and presented as a practical solution to a deadly problem, began to take root. By the following winter, a dozen ranches had built variations of what they called Pryce shelters, not full homes, but storm-proofed sheds for vulnerable livestock and small semi-dugout shacks for cowhands wintering on the range. The number of men lost to exposure dropped. The number of calves surviving their first winter increased. The idea spread not because it was novel, but because it worked. Iorwerth Pryce's solution was an intuitive leap, born from the unique knowledge of his trade. But what he had built was a precursor to modern architectural concepts that would take another century to be fully understood and articulated. His cleft home was, in essence, a passive, earth-sheltered structure. Modern building science has given names to the principles he mastered. We call it geothermal coupling, or passive annual heat storage. Engineers today use complex calculations to determine the thermal flywheel effect of massive materials. Architects design buildings with wind-baffling features to create zones of still air, reducing the convective heat loss that Pryce had identified as the true enemy. He had no equations, no computer models, no technical jargon. He had only the memory of the steady cool of a deep mine, the feel of a solid rock face, and the desperate need to keep his family warm. His innovation was a quiet triumph of observation over convention. There is a lesson in Iorwerth Pryce's story that goes beyond the physics of heat transfer. It is a story about the nature of ingenuity itself. The American frontier is often mythologized as a place of conquest, of man bending the wilderness to his will. The hero of that story is the axe wielder, the dam builder, the man who imposes order on a chaotic landscape. His structures are statements of defiance, standing tall and square against the horizon. Pryce's genius was of a different, quieter kind. He did not seek to conquer the mountain, he sought its cooperation. He did not build against the wind. He found a place where the wind could not go. His wisdom was not in opposition, but in accommodation. It was a philosophy born of his old trade, where a man does not argue with 1,000 tons of slate. He learns its grain, its weaknesses, its lines of force, and he works with them. To survive, he must be humble before the power of the stone. In a valley of men who saw the mountains as a backdrop to their struggle, Iorwerth Pryce saw the mountain as a partner. He didn't build a monument to his own strength. He simply stepped behind the strength that was already there, a wall the earth had finished building geologic ages before he arrived. He built a home, and in doing so, he taught a profound truth. Sometimes the greatest strength lies not in standing firm against the storm, but in finding the quiet place that the storm cannot touch. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you found this exploration of historical engineering and human resilience valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more content. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever seen an example of old knowledge proving superior to a modern approach? The content of this video is for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictionalized for narrative effect, while the technical principles are based on real historical practices and scientific concepts. The application of any building techniques should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety standards, and regulations. This video does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.